England, 1821. The kitchens of Wycliffe Manor lay shrouded in darkness. The massive hearth reduced to glowing embers that cast dancing shadows across copper pots and worn stone floors. Beyond the mullioned windows, early spring rain drummed against the glass with insistent fingers, while inside the great house, servants slept soundly in their quarters above the scullery. No one stirred. No one watched. No one, that is, except the Duke of Wycliffe himself. Grayson Hartley stood motionless in the doorway of the larder, his tall frame concealed by shadow, his blue eyes fixed upon the slender figure moving through his kitchen with the quiet desperation of the truly hungry. This was the third time in as many weeks that the woman had appeared, and tonight he had finally positioned himself to catch her in the act. She was thin, far too thin. Her movements careful despite their urgency. The dark cloak she wore hung loose on her frame, and beneath it he could glimpse a gown that had once been fine, but now showed the careful mending of someone who understood that cloth must last when there was no money for replacement. Her hands, pale in the dim light, worked quickly as she gathered bread from the pantry, wrapping the loaves in a cloth with movements that suggested long practice at making do with little. Grayson had encountered thieves before. London was full of them, desperate creatures who would steal anything not secured behind lock and key. But this woman moved differently. There was no furtiveness in her bearing, no guilty glances over her shoulder. Instead, she worked with quiet efficiency, taking only bread, ignoring the silver that sat in plain view on the sideboard. Passing by the wine cellar whose door stood conveniently ajar, he waited until her arms were full before stepping forward into the light. "I believe that belongs to me," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The woman froze, her green eyes wide as she turned to face him. For a long moment, they stood regarding one another across the kitchen, the loaves of bread clutched against her chest like a shield. Grayson had expected fear, perhaps tears, certainly the sort of grovelling apology that usually accompanied discovery. What he saw instead in her expression was something far more complex. Resignation mixed with defiance, and beneath both, a bone-deep weariness that spoke of struggles he could only imagine. "Your Grace," she said finally, her voice steady despite the circumstances. She did not curtsy, did not lower her gaze. "I apologize for the intrusion." "You apologize for the intrusion," Grayson repeated slowly. "But not, I notice, for the theft itself." A muscle tightened in her jaw. "I cannot apologize for keeping children from starving, Your Grace, though I regret the necessity of taking what is not mine. Children." That gave him pause. He studied her more closely, noting details he had missed in his initial observation. Her clothes, though mended, were scrupulously clean. Her hair, a rich chestnut brown pulled back in a simple knot, showed no sign of neglect despite her obvious poverty. Her hands, though work-worn, bore no dirt beneath the nails. This was not a woman who had abandoned propriety, but one whom circumstances had forced into desperate measures. "Explain," he commanded, gesturing to one of the wooden chairs that surrounded the kitchen's massive work table. "And you may begin with your name." She hesitated, then seemed to decide that cooperation might serve her better than resistance. Setting the bread carefully on the table, she sank into the offered chair with a grace that spoke of better days. "Adelaide Fairmont, Your Grace. I am the daughter of the late Viscount Fairmont of Derbyshire. A viscount's daughter, stealing bread from his kitchen. The scandal sheets would feast on such a story for weeks." "I remember your father," Grayson said, pulling out a chair across from her. "He died some years ago, did he not? Financial difficulties, if I recall correctly." 10 years ago, Adelaide confirmed, her voice betraying no emotion at the mention. "He left substantial debts. What remained after settling them was insufficient to maintain even our modest household. My mother passed 2 years before him. And yet you identify yourself as his daughter rather than by marriage," Grayson observed. "You are unmarried then?" A faint colour touched her cheeks. "I am 28 years old, Your Grace. My prospects for marriage disappeared along with my dowry long ago. But that is hardly relevant to the current situation." She was right, though Grayson found himself oddly curious about this woman who sat in his kitchen with such composure despite being caught in an act that could see her transported to the colonies. The children you mentioned. Yours? No. Adelaide's expression softened slightly, the first break in her careful composure. They are 11 girls, ages 6 to 14, who were students at the Fairmont School of Charity. After my mother's death, I assumed direction of the school she had founded. For 10 years, I maintained it as best I could, taking in orphans and daughters of the poor, teaching them to read and write, preparing them for positions as governesses or companions. You speak in the past tense, Grayson noted, though something cold had begun to settle in his chest at her words. What happened to this school? Adelaide's gaze met his directly, and in her green eyes he saw accusation tempered by acceptance. 4 months ago, the building was demolished. The land upon which it stood was purchased by the Duke of Wycliffe for the expansion of his stables. We were given 3 days' notice to vacate the premises. The cold in Grayson's chest spread outward, freezing him in place. He remembered the transaction, remembered signing the documents his man of business had presented. But the details, the specific building, the purpose it had served, those had been written in the dense legal language that his eyes had skimmed over, his mind filling in what he assumed must be there, rather than what the words actually said. His damned dyslexia had betrayed him again, though he could never admit as much. I see, he managed, his voice rougher than intended. And you have been caring for these children alone since then? There was no one else, Adelaide replied simply. The families who had placed their daughters with us were either dead or unable to take them back. The parish workhouse would have separated them, sent them to different facilities. I could not allow that. So I found an abandoned cellar at the edge of your estate, and there we have been living these 4 months. Living in a cellar, Grayson repeated, anger beginning to stir beneath his shock. And you thought stealing from my kitchen was preferable to seeking proper help? For the first time, Adelaide's composure cracked, a flash of fierce pride crossing her features. I did seek help, Your Grace. I petitioned the parish council. I wrote to the bishop. I even approached Reverend Whitmore directly, though I knew his stance on such matters. Do you know what he told me? That these particular children were undeserving of Christian charity. Their mothers were unwed, or their fathers were criminals, or they themselves showed signs of moral weakness. He called them undesirables and suggested I stop enabling their wickedness by feeding them. The bread on the table between them suddenly took on new significance. Not the theft of a desperate woman, but the methodical provision of someone who had exhausted every proper avenue and found them all closed. How have you been managing? Grayson asked, his voice quieter now. Surely bread alone cannot sustain 11 children for 4 months. We forage what we can, Adelaide said, some of the fire leaving her voice. There are still vegetables in abandoned gardens, berries in the hedgerows. I have sold everything of value that remained from my family's estate. The bread is for little Rose, who has developed a fever and can keep nothing else down. She is only 6 years old, Your Grace, and I fear. Her voice caught, the first sign of the fear she must be carrying. I fear she may not survive if she does not receive proper care soon. Grayson stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the stone floor. A 6-year-old child, feverish and starving, while he slept in comfort upstairs, unaware that such suffering existed on his own lands. The weight of his unknowing culpability pressed down upon him with crushing force. The other children, he said, pacing to the window and back. You mentioned one reads 3 languages. Adelaide nodded, seeming surprised by the question. Diana. She is 14, brilliant beyond measure. Before the school closed, she was reading French, Latin, and Italian. She has a gift for languages that I have rarely seen, even among the privileged boys who attend university. With proper education, she could become a remarkable governess, perhaps even a translator. But such positions require references, proper clothing, connections that we no longer possess. And the others? They each have their own strengths, Adelaide said, and despite everything, there was pride in her voice. Mary excels at mathematics. Charlotte has a beautiful singing voice. Emma shows promise in drawing. They are children, Your Grace, not the moral deficients that Reverend Whitmore would have you believe. They deserve better than slowly starving in a cellar while the world ignores their existence. Grayson turned from the window to face her fully. You have been stealing bread for 4 months to feed 11 children, and yet you appear to be the one most in need of a decent meal. Why is that, Miss Fairmont? She looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. The children are growing. They need sustenance more than I do. I am already grown. I can manage on less. It was perhaps the most quietly heroic statement Grayson had ever heard. This woman, this penniless Viscount's daughter, had been slowly starving herself to keep 11 unwanted children alive, had risked transportation or imprisonment by stealing from his kitchen, all while maintaining the dignity and cleanliness that suggested she had not yet surrendered her sense of self-worth. And he, unknowingly, had been the cause of it all. Take me to them, he said abruptly. To this cellar where you have been living. I would see these conditions for myself. Adelaide's eyes widened. Your Grace, it is past midnight and raining. Surely this can wait until... Now, Miss Fairmont. Grayson's voice left no room for argument. If this child Rose is as ill as you say, then every moment matters. You will take me to see her and the others immediately, or I will have my men search every cellar on my lands until we find you. The choice is yours, but either way, I will see for myself what my ignorance has wrought. For a long moment, Adelaide simply looked at him, as though trying to divine his intentions. Finally, she rose from her chair, gathering the bread once more into her arms. Very well, Your Grace, she said quietly. But I warn you, it is not a pleasant sight. These are children who have known comfort and care, reduced to living like animals in the dark. If you have any compassion in your heart, you will not judge them too harshly for what poverty has made of them. It is not the children I intend to judge, Miss Fairmont, Grayson replied, reaching for his greatcoat from where it hung by the kitchen door. Now lead the way, and pray that we are in time to help the little one. As they stepped out into the rain-soaked night, Adelaide leading the way along a muddy path that skirted the edge of his property, Grayson found himself reviewing everything he thought he knew about his own estate. How had he not known that 11 children and their teacher were living in such conditions on his land? How had his stewards not reported it? Or had they reported it, and he had simply not paid attention, too caught up in his London affairs and his careful management of a disability that he dared not let anyone discover? The rain soaked through his coat as they walked, but he barely noticed. His mind was too full of the woman ahead of him, moving through the darkness with the confidence of long familiarity. Her thin figure bent against the wind as she clutched the stolen bread to her chest. Adelaide Fairmont, daughter of a Viscount, director of a school that he had destroyed without ever knowing it existed. A school that had been founded by Miss Catherine Fairmont. The name struck him like a physical blow, and he nearly stopped walking. Catherine Fairmont, the patient, kind woman who had taught him to read when he was 8 years old, and every tutor his father hired had declared him unteachable. The woman who had developed special methods for children, who saw letters dancing on the page, who had spent hours helping him decode the symbols that others found so simple. She had never told him her daughter's name, had maintained perfect professional discretion about her personal life. And now that daughter was living in a cellar because he had signed a document he had not properly read. Here, Adelaide's voice cut through his thoughts. They had arrived at what appeared to be an old root cellar, half buried in the hillside, with a door that hung crooked on its hinges. I must ask you to be quiet, Your Grace. The children will be frightened if we wake them suddenly. She pushed open the door, and the smell hit him immediately. Damp earth, unwashed bodies, sickness. Stepping inside, Grayson had to bend his head to avoid the low ceiling. A single candle burned in the corner, casting barely enough light to see by, and there, huddled together for warmth on piles of straw covered with thin blankets, were 11 small forms. One of them, a girl of perhaps 12, stirred as they entered. "Miss Adelaide," she whispered, "you came back. We were worried." "Hush, Mary," Adelaide whispered back, moving to the girl's side. "All is well. I have brought help." But Grayson was no longer listening. His eyes had found the smallest figure, curled in the driest corner with another child's arm around her protectively. Even in the dim light, he could see the flush of fever on her small face, hear the rasp of her breathing. Rose, 6 years old and burning with fever in a cellar that was barely fit for storing vegetables, let alone housing children. Something inside him that had been frozen for years suddenly cracked and fell away. "Miss Fairmont," he said, and his voice carried the weight of command that came with his title. "Gather the children, all of them. You are moving into Wycliffe Manor before dawn, and I will hear no argument on the matter." The morning sun filtered weakly through gaps in the cellar's earthen ceiling, casting striped shadows across a scene that would haunt Grayson for months to come. What had been barely visible by candlelight the previous night now revealed itself in heartbreaking detail. 11 young lives maintained with meticulous care despite conditions that no human, let alone children, should endure. The cellar itself was perhaps 20 feet square, carved into the hillside generations ago for storing root vegetables. Moisture seeped through the earthen walls, creating dark patches that glistened in the dim light. The floor was packed dirt, covered in places with straw that Adelaide had clearly gathered from nearby fields. Along one wall, crude shelves held a few precious possessions: chipped cups, a battered kettle, several books with water-stained covers. In the corner, a makeshift hearth of stacked stones held the remnants of a small fire, though the ventilation was so poor that Grayson wondered how they managed without suffocating themselves. But it was what Adelaide had created despite these conditions that caught his attention. The children's sleeping area, though formed of mere straw and threadbare blankets, was arranged with geometric precision, each girl's space clearly defined and kept as clean as circumstances allowed. Along the opposite wall, several flat stones had been positioned at varying heights to serve as writing surfaces. Pieces of slate, most cracked or chipped, leaned against the wall beside carefully rationed stubs of chalk. Even a rope stretched between two support beams, from which hung garments that, while patched and faded, showed the same meticulous care as everything else in this underground refuge. The children themselves were awakening now, stirred by Adelaide's gentle touches and quiet words. They ranged in age from little Rose, whose fever-flushed face appeared even more alarming in daylight, to Diana, a tall girl with sharp eyes that took in Grayson's presence with immediate wariness. "Girls," Adelaide said softly, positioning herself between them and the Duke in an instinctively protective gesture. "This is the Duke of Wycliffe. He has come to see our school." Grayson watched as 11 pairs of eyes turned toward him with varying degrees of fear and suspicion. These were children who had learned that adults in positions of power rarely brought good news. "Good morning," he said, keeping his voice gentle despite the anger churning in his chest. Anger directed entirely at himself. "Miss Fairmont has told me about your studies. I confess myself curious to see what you have been learning." It was Diana who responded, rising from her place beside Rose with the bearing of someone years older than her 14 years. "We begin each morning with reading practice, Your Grace. Then mathematics, followed by geography and history. Miss Adelaide teaches us French in the afternoons when we have sufficient light to see the letters properly." The formality of her speech, delivered in a voice roughened by cold and damp, struck Grayson forcefully. This child spoke like a gentlewoman, not a pauper living in a cellar. "Would you demonstrate?" he asked, gesturing to the slate boards. Diana glanced at Adelaide, who nodded encouragement. The girl moved to one of the slate surfaces and picked up a piece of chalk. "What would you have me write, Your Grace?" "Something of your own choosing," Grayson replied, genuinely curious now. With careful, practiced movements, Diana began to write. Not in English, but in French, her letters precise despite the poor quality of her materials. "La connaissance est la seule richesse que la pauvreté ne peut pas voler." Knowledge is the only wealth that poverty cannot steal. Diana composed that herself, Adelaide said quietly, and there was unmistakable pride in her voice. She has quite a gift for languages. As if emboldened by Diana's example, other girls began to rise, gathering their slate boards and chalk stubs. A child of perhaps 10, Adelaide quietly identified her as Mary, demonstrated multiplication tables with a speed that impressed Grayson. Another girl, Charlotte, shyly showed a slate covered with carefully drawn maps of England, each county labelled in neat script. Emma, no more than 8, presented sketches of flowers and birds, remarkable in their detail despite being rendered in simple chalk on poor slate. But it was the methods themselves that truly captured Grayson's attention. The way Adelaide moved among the girls, correcting gently, encouraging constantly. The way she positioned herself to ensure each child could see her face clearly when she spoke. The way she broke complex ideas into smaller pieces, demonstrating with physical objects when words alone proved insufficient. And most tellingly, the way she seemed to know instinctively when a child was struggling not from lack of intelligence, but from the way information was being presented. He had seen these methods before, felt their gentle guidance as a child who could not understand why the letters on a page refused to stay in their proper places, who had been called stupid and lazy by tutors who assumed that difficulty reading equaled deficiency of mind. He remembered hands that had never struck him for his failures, a voice that had never expressed impatience with his struggles, a patient teacher who had saved him from the crushing weight of his own father's disappointment. "Your mother," he found himself saying, interrupting a geography lesson. "Catherine Fairmont. She developed these teaching methods, did she not?" Adelaide turned to him, surprise evident on her face. "Yes, Your Grace. You are familiar with her work." "I am familiar with her legacy," Grayson replied carefully, his throat tight. She was renowned for her ability to teach children whom others had deemed unteachable. A soft smile crossed Adelaide's features, the first genuine warmth he had seen from her. Mother believed that every child could learn, given the proper approach. She used to say that the failure was never in the student, but in the teacher's inability to discover how that particular mind processed information. She developed special techniques for children who struggled with traditional methods. "Including children of noble birth?" Grayson asked, though he knew the answer. "On rare occasions," Adelaide confirmed. "Mother was very discreet about her private students, but I know she took particular pride in one young boy, the son of a duke, I believe. She never told me his name, of course. Professional confidence forbade it, but she often spoke of him as her greatest success. A child everyone had written off as simple-minded, who, with the proper methods, proved to have a brilliant analytical mind hidden beneath his difficulty with written words." The weight of understanding crashed down upon Grayson with crushing force. The school he had destroyed had not been some random charity institution. It had been the continuation of Catherine Fairmont's work, carried on by her daughter. Every method Adelaide used with these children had been developed by the woman who had saved him from a childhood of shame and failure. And he, through his own inability to properly read a legal document, had demolished the building that housed her legacy. The irony was so bitter he could taste it. His dyslexia, the very condition for which Catherine Fairmont had created her methods, had led directly to the destruction of the school where those methods were still being taught. "Your Grace?" Adelaide's voice held concern. "Are you quite well? You have gone very pale." Before Grayson could respond, a small sound drew all their attention. Rose, still curled in her corner, had begun to shiver violently despite the blankets piled upon her. Her breathing came in short, laboured gasps, and when Adelaide rushed to her side, the child's eyes rolled back in her head. "Rose!" Adelaide cried, gathering the little girl into her arms. "No, no, sweetheart, stay with me." The other children pressed closer, their faces reflecting various degrees of terror. Diana dropped to her knees beside Adelaide, her hands hovering uselessly over the fevered child. "She was better yesterday," the older girl said, her voice breaking. "Miss Adelaide, she was better. Fevers can spike suddenly," Adelaide replied, though her own fear was evident in the trembling of her hands as she felt Rose's forehead. "She needs a physician. She needs medicine. She needs to be removed from this damned cellar immediately," Grayson interrupted, striding forward. Without waiting for permission, he bent and lifted Rose from Adelaide's arms. The child weighed almost nothing, her small body burning with heat even through the layers of blankets. "All of you, you are moving into Wycliffe Manor. Now. This moment." Adelaide surged to her feet, blocking his path to the door. "Your Grace, that is impossible. We cannot simply invade your household without—" "You can and you will." Grayson cut her off, his voice brooking no argument. "This child is desperately ill. These conditions are intolerable. I have the means and the space to provide proper shelter, and I will not stand here debating propriety while a 6-year-old dies in my arms. You do not understand the implications, Adelaide insisted, though her eyes kept returning to Rose's flushed face. The scandal of 11 charity children residing under your roof, the questions it will raise, the damage to your reputation. My reputation can weather far worse than providing shelter to children in need, Grayson replied. Your concern for my standing is admirable but misplaced. Now step aside, Miss Fairmont, or I will walk through you. For a long moment, Adelaide stood frozen, pride warring with practicality across her expressive face. Then Diana's voice, quiet but steady, broke the impasse. Miss Adelaide, Rose needs help. Please, let him help her. The fight went out of Adelaide's posture. Very well, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But only until Rose recovers. Then we will find another arrangement. We will discuss permanent arrangements after we have ensured this child's survival, Grayson said, already moving toward the door with Rose in his arms. Diana, is it? I need you to run ahead to the manor. Tell the first servant you encounter to fetch Dr. Morrison immediately. Tell them the Duke commands it. Can you do that? Diana nodded sharply and darted past them, her long legs carrying her swiftly up the muddy path toward the distant manor house. The rest of you, Grayson continued, addressing the remaining children who huddled together in various states of shock and hope. Gather whatever possessions you wish to bring. We leave in 10 minutes. What followed was a flurry of activity as 10 children scrambled to collect their meagre belongings. Grayson watched over Rose's head as Adelaide moved among them, helping the younger ones fold their blankets, ensuring no one left behind anything precious. The efficiency with which they packed suggested they had practiced this before, perhaps feared this moment when their fragile shelter would finally be taken from them. Within the promised 10 minutes, they emerged from the cellar into morning sunlight that seemed almost accusatory in its cheerfulness. Grayson led the procession, Rose still cradled against his chest, her breathing growing more labored with each step. Behind him came Adelaide and the 10 other girls, ranging from tiny Emma clutching a cloth doll to Mary carrying a stack of precious books tied with string. The walk to Wycliffe Manor took perhaps 15 minutes, but to Grayson it felt like hours. Rose stirred occasionally, mumbling words he could not distinguish. Her fever seemed to be climbing higher, her small body shaking with chills despite the warmth of his greatcoat wrapped around her. Servants scattered at their approach, eyes wide with shock at the sight of their Duke carrying a sick child, followed by a ragged parade of girls and a woman who looked barely better fed than her charges. But Grayson paid them no mind, issuing orders as he climbed the front steps. Mrs. Hughes, prepare rooms in the West Wing. 11 beds, proper linens, fires in every hearth. Miss Fairmont and her students will be residing with us indefinitely. Jenkins, send word to Dr. Morrison that his immediate presence is required. Tell him it is a matter of life and death. The housekeeper, a woman who had served the Wycliffe family for 30 years, took one look at Rose's flushed face and snapped into action. At once, Your Grace. Mary, fetch clean linens. Thomas, stoke the fires in the West Wing. Alice, prepare basins of cool water and gather all the extra blankets you can find. Within moments, the manor was alive with purposeful movement. Grayson carried Rose to a room on the second floor, laying her carefully on a bed that must have seemed impossibly soft after months on straw and dirt. A maid appeared with cool water and cloths, which Adelaide immediately put to use, gently bathing Rose's burning forehead. Stay with her, Grayson ordered, though he could see Adelaide had no intention of leaving the child's side. I will ensure the other girls are settled. In the hallway outside, he found the remaining 10 children clustered together, overwhelmed by the grandeur of their surroundings. They stood on marble floors they feared to dirty with their worn shoes, surrounded by furnishings that cost more than their families had earned in lifetimes. Come, Grayson said, gentling his voice. Let me show you to your rooms. The West Wing had been unused for years, maintained but empty since his mother's death. Now it came alive with the presence of children who had known only hardship, their wonder at simple comforts. Warm beds, clean linens, windows that closed properly, serving as a harsh indictment of everything they had been forced to endure. As Grayson watched them explore their new quarters with tentative joy, something fundamental shifted inside him. These children, this school, Adelaide Fairmont herself, they represented a debt he had not known he owed, a debt to the woman who had taught him that difficulty learning did not mean deficiency of character, a debt to the methods that had saved him from a childhood of shame, a debt he had nearly destroyed through his own careless blindness. He would spend however long it took to make this right, whatever Adelaide needed, whatever these children required, whatever it cost him in reputation or resources, he would provide it, because Catherine Fairmont had once saved a struggling boy from drowning in his own inadequacy. The least he could do was ensure her daughter and her students would never go hungry again. The transformation of the West Wing began within hours of the children's arrival, and by evening, what had been silent, shuttered rooms had become something resembling a home. Mrs. Hughes, despite her initial shock at finding her orderly household invaded by 11 charity children, proved remarkably efficient once she understood the gravity of Rose's condition. Maids bustled through hallways, carrying armloads of linens and towels. Footmen hauled buckets of hot water for baths, and cook raided her stores to prepare broth suitable for invalids and hearty stew for growing children who had known too many hungry days. Adelaide moved through it all in a daze of exhaustion and disbelief, her attention divided between supervising Rose's care and ensuring her other girls did not damage anything in their new surroundings. The children themselves seemed almost afraid to touch the fine furnishings, walking on tiptoe across Persian rugs and keeping their hands clasped tightly to avoid accidentally brushing against silk curtains or mahogany tables. "They may touch things, you know," came a voice from the doorway of what had been designated as the schoolroom. Adelaide turned to find a woman of perhaps 30 years regarding her with an expression of frank curiosity. She was handsome rather than beautiful, with dark hair like Grayson's and the same penetrating blue eyes, though hers held warmth where his were often shuttered. "I am Lady Margaret Hartley, the Duke's sister, and you must be the mysterious Miss Fairmont, who has thrown our household into such delightful chaos." Adelaide curtsied, acutely aware of her shabby dress and dishevelled appearance. "Your ladyship, I apologise for the intrusion. Your brother was quite insistent." "Grayson is always insistent when he has decided upon a course of action," Margaret interrupted, moving into the room with the easy confidence of someone long accustomed to her surroundings. "What surprises me is that he decided upon this particular course. My brother is not known for spontaneous acts of charity." Her gaze travelled over the children who had frozen at her entrance, taking in their worn clothing and too thin frames. Though perhaps in this case, spontaneity was overdue. Diana, ever protective, stepped forward. "We did not ask to be brought here, my lady. Miss Adelaide would have managed. She always manages." Margaret's expression softened at the fierce loyalty in the girl's voice. "I am certain she does. What is your name, child?" "Diana Mercer, my lady." The girl's chin lifted with pride despite her circumstances. "I am 14 years old, and I can read French, Latin, and Italian. I can also calculate compound interest and recite the complete genealogy of English monarchs back to William the Conqueror." "Can you indeed?" Margaret moved closer, genuine interest replacing her initial skepticism. "Then perhaps you can tell me, in French, what you think of your new accommodations." Diana did not hesitate. "Je pense que c'est comme un rêve duquel je crains de me réveiller. Les lits sont doux, l'air est chaud, et pour la première fois en 4 mois, ma petite Rose dort dans un endroit digne d'un enfant. I think it is like a dream from which I fear to wake. The beds are soft, the air is warm, and for the first time in 4 months, little Rose sleeps in a place worthy of a child." Margaret blinked, clearly surprised by both the fluency and the sentiment. "Your accent is excellent. Who taught you?" "Miss Adelaide," Diana replied, gesturing toward her teacher with obvious affection. "She teaches all of us. Reading, writing, mathematics, geography, history, and languages. She says education is the only inheritance that cannot be taken away by poverty or circumstance." "A wise philosophy," Margaret murmured, her gaze shifting to Adelaide with new respect. and one that suggests your teacher is far more than a simple charity worker. She paused, studying Adelaide more carefully. Fairmont. I remember that name. Your mother was Catherine Fairmont, was she not? The woman who developed those special teaching methods? Adelaide felt her throat tighten at the mention of her mother. Yes, my lady. She believed every child deserved the opportunity to learn, regardless of their station or natural aptitude. Oh, I remember hearing of her work, Margaret said thoughtfully. There were rumours that she had even tutored children of the nobility, though she kept their identities strictly confidential. Her eyes flickered with something Adelaide could not quite interpret. Tell me, Miss Fairmont, do you know if my brother was aware of your mother's legacy when he purchased the land where your school stood? The question was delicately phrased, but Adelaide heard the concern beneath it. I do not believe so, my lady. The transaction was handled through intermediaries. I doubt the Duke knew anything about the building beyond its location. I see. Margaret's expression suggested she understood more than Adelaide had said. Well, regardless of how you came to be here, you are here now, and these children need care. Mrs. Hughes will provide whatever you require. Do not hesitate to ask. Before Adelaide could respond, a commotion from the hallway announced Dr. Morrison's arrival. The physician, a stern-faced man of middle years, swept into Rose's room with his black bag and an air of professional competence. Adelaide followed, her heart in her throat as she watched him examine the small girl who had barely stirred since their arrival. The examination seemed to take forever. Dr. Morrison checked Rose's temperature, listened to her breathing, examined her throat and the glands in her neck. Finally, he turned to Adelaide with an expression that made her knees weak with relief. Pneumonia, he pronounced, but caught early enough to treat. The fever should break within 2 days if we keep her warm, well hydrated, and dose her with this medicine every 4 hours. He withdrew a brown bottle from his bag. She will need constant supervision. Can you manage that? I will not leave her side, Adelaide promised. Good. I will return tomorrow to check on her progress. In the meantime, keep her comfortable and make certain she drinks as much water or broth as you can coax into her. He paused, his stern expression softening slightly. The Duke mentioned there are 10 other children requiring examination. I should like to see them all before I leave, to ensure none are harbouring similar infections. What followed was a thorough examination of all 11 girls. Dr. Morrison checked each child with meticulous care, making notes in a small leather journal about nutritional deficiencies, minor ailments, and recommended treatments. Emma had a persistent cough that required a tonic. Charlotte's eyesight was poor and would benefit from spectacles. Mary had a rash from the damp conditions of the cellar that needed salve, but overall, he pronounced them remarkably healthy, considering their circumstances. You have done well by them, Miss Fairmont, he said quietly as he prepared to leave. Many children living in such conditions would be far worse off. Your care has likely saved lives. Adelaide could only nod, too overcome with emotion to speak. For 4 months, she had lived in constant fear that her best efforts would not be enough, that she would lose one of her girls to illness or starvation, despite everything she tried. To hear a respected physician acknowledge that she had succeeded, at least in keeping them alive, was almost more than she could bear. Over the following days, a routine began to establish itself. Rose's fever broke on the 3rd night, exactly as Dr. Morrison had predicted. The other girls settled into their new quarters with a mixture of wonder and growing confidence. Adelaide, refusing to be idle despite their changed circumstances, insisted on maintaining their educational schedule. Each morning at 8, the girls gathered in the designated schoolroom for reading practice. At 9, mathematics. 10 o'clock brought geography and history, followed by a brief recess in the gardens where the children could run and play under Adelaide's watchful eye. Afternoons were devoted to French lessons, and for the older girls, more advanced subjects like composition and natural philosophy. It was during one of these lessons that Adelaide first became aware of being observed. She was helping Emma sound out a particularly difficult word, when movement in the hallway caught her eye. There, partially concealed by the doorframe, stood the Duke of Wycliffe, watching the proceedings with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. She did not acknowledge his presence, but she became acutely aware of it. The way his eyes followed her movements as she circulated among the children. The slight smile that touched his lips when Diana corrected Mary's French pronunciation with gentle firmness. The almost painful attention with which he watched her demonstrate how to break complex words into manageable syllables. He appeared again the next day, and the day after that, always standing just out of sight in the hallway, never entering the room, never interrupting, simply watching with that same focused intensity that suggested he was seeing something more than a simple lesson. It was Mary who finally broke the unspoken agreement to ignore his presence. During a particularly challenging mathematics problem, she looked up to find the Duke standing in the doorway, no longer attempting to hide. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "Can you help me with this sum? I cannot make it balance properly." Grayson hesitated, clearly surprised at being addressed directly. Then, to Adelaide's astonishment, he entered the room and moved to Mary's side. "Show me what you have done so far." Mary explained her calculations, pointing to the figures she had written on her slate. Grayson studied them for a moment, then gently took the slate and chalk from her hands. "You have the right approach, but you have made an error here. See? You added when you should have subtracted. It is an easy mistake to make when the numbers grow large." He demonstrated the correction with a patience that surprised Adelaide, his large hand making neat figures despite the awkward chalk and slate. Mary's face brightened as understanding dawned. "Oh, I see it now. Thank you, Your Grace." "You are welcome." Grayson handed back the slate, then seemed to notice the broken corner that made it difficult to hold. "This slate is damaged. You should have a new one. We make do with what we have," Mary replied philosophically. "Miss Adelaide says that learning to work with imperfect tools builds character." Something in Grayson's expression shifted at those words. Without comment, he left the room, returning minutes later with a box containing a dozen pristine slate boards and 3 boxes of fresh chalk. "Character building is admirable," he said, setting the box on Adelaide's desk, "but there is no virtue in unnecessary struggle when better tools are available." The children swarmed the box with exclamations of delight, each claiming a new slate board and testing the smooth surface with reverent fingers. Adelaide watched them, torn between gratitude and unease at accepting such a gift. "Your Grace," she began, "this is too generous. We cannot—" "You can and will," Grayson interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "Consider it an investment in their education." His eyes met hers across the room, and Adelaide saw something in them that made her breath catch. Not pity, as she had feared, but something far more complex. Respect, perhaps, or admiration, or something she dared not name. By the end of the second week, even the shyest of the girls had lost their initial fear of the Duke. He had become a regular presence during their lessons, sometimes offering assistance, more often simply observing. Adelaide noticed that he paid particular attention to the methods she used, especially when working with children who struggled with certain concepts. He seemed to be studying not just what she taught, but how she taught it. It was Lady Margaret who finally commented on her brother's unusual behaviour. She had taken to joining them for afternoon tea, charmed by Diana's precocious intelligence and Charlotte's sweet singing voice. On this particular afternoon, Grayson had just left after spending an hour helping the younger girls with their handwriting exercises. "I have not seen my brother smile so much in years," Margaret observed, stirring sugar into her tea. "Whatever you are doing, Miss Fairmont, it agrees with him." Adelaide felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I am doing nothing but educating the children, my lady. If the Duke finds that agreeable, I am glad of it." "He finds you agreeable," Margaret corrected gently. "There is a difference." She set down her cup, her expression growing more serious. "I should warn you, however, that not everyone will view this arrangement as favourably as I do. My brother's decision to house 11 charity children has already sparked considerable gossip among the local society." As if to punctuate her warning, the following evening brought that society to Wycliffe Manor in the form of a dinner party that Grayson could not gracefully cancel. Adelaide had planned to take a tray in her room, but Lady Margaret insisted she attend. "You are residing under my brother's roof as a guest, not a servant," Margaret argued, dismissing Adelaide's protests about appropriate dress. "I have gowns that will suit you perfectly. We are of a similar height, and a few adjustments will make them fit well enough." Thus Adelaide found herself descending the grand staircase that evening, wearing a gown of dove-grey silk that was finer than anything she had owned even before her family's financial ruin. Margaret had insisted on having her hair properly dressed, and Adelaide barely recognised herself in the mirror. The dinner guests had already assembled in the drawing room when Adelaide entered on Lady Margaret's arm. Conversation faltered as eyes turned toward her, assessing and judging. Adelaide recognised several of the women from her earlier life in society, though none had acknowledged her existence since her father's death and the loss of her dowry. "Lady Whitmore, Lady Pemberton, Mrs. Ashton," Margaret said smoothly, making introductions with the ease of long practice. "May I present Miss Adelaide Fairmont, who is currently residing at Wycliffe as my guest." Lady Whitmore, a woman whose sharp features matched her sharper tongue, raised her lorgnette to study Adelaide with undisguised curiosity. "Fairmont. I remember that name. Your father was Viscount Fairmont of Derbyshire, was he not? I heard he died in unfortunate circumstances." "My father passed 10 years ago," Adelaide replied evenly. "The circumstances were sad but not scandalous, if that is what you are implying." "I implied nothing," Lady Whitmore said, though her smile suggested otherwise. "I merely expressed surprise at finding you here. The Duke is not known for entertaining impoverished relations." "Miss Fairmont is not a relation," Lady Margaret interjected before Adelaide could respond. "She is the daughter of Catherine Fairmont, the renowned educator. She continues her mother's work teaching disadvantaged children." "How charitable," murmured Mrs. Ashton, though her tone made charity sound like an affliction. "And these children are residing here at Wycliffe as well, I understand. Quite the unusual arrangement." Adelaide felt her spine stiffen. The children were in need of proper shelter and medical care. The Duke was kind enough to provide both. "I see nothing unusual in Christian compassion." "Christian compassion is one thing," Lady Pemberton observed, her fan moving in a languid rhythm. "But 11 children of unknown parentage living in a Duke's household raises certain questions about propriety, does it not?" Before Adelaide could formulate a response that would not result in her being asked to leave, Grayson's voice cut across the drawing room with quiet authority. "The only question of propriety that concerns me," he said, moving to stand beside Adelaide in a gesture of unmistakable support, "is why these children were allowed to suffer in the first place when people of means and influence could have prevented it. Miss Fairmont has demonstrated more genuine nobility in caring for them than many who claim that title through birth alone." The room fell silent. Adelaide felt her throat tighten with emotion at his public defence, even as she recognised the risk he was taking with his reputation. Lady Whitmore recovered first, snapping her fan closed with a decisive click. "Well, how very progressive of you, Your Grace. I am certain the Bishop will be most interested to hear of your new charitable endeavour." "I am certain he will," Grayson agreed, his tone suggesting he cared very little for the Bishop's opinion. "Now, shall we proceed to dinner? Cook has prepared quite a feast, and it would be a shame to let it grow cold." As they filed into the dining room, Adelaide found herself seated between a kind but elderly gentleman who spoke little and Lady Margaret, who maintained a steady stream of conversation that required minimal participation. Across the table, Grayson sat silent and watchful, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. But Adelaide felt the weight of his gaze throughout the meal, and when their eyes met across the gleaming silver and crystal, something passed between them that had nothing to do with charity or propriety or social expectations, something that both frightened and thrilled her in equal measure. The evening ended with the ladies withdrawing to the drawing room while the gentlemen took their port. Lady Whitmore wasted no time in resuming her subtle attacks. "Tell me, Miss Fairmont," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the room, "how long do you intend to impose upon the Duke's hospitality? Surely you do not expect this arrangement to be permanent?" Adelaide met her gaze steadily. "I expect nothing beyond what His Grace chooses to offer. When he indicates that it is time for us to seek other accommodations, we shall do so with gratitude for his kindness." "How very accommodating of you," Lady Whitmore replied, and the emphasis she placed on the word made it sound vaguely indecent. It was then that Adelaide understood. These women did not simply question the propriety of children living at Wycliffe. They questioned her presence there. They suspected motives beyond simple charity, imagined schemes that existed nowhere but in their own minds. And looking at their pinched, suspicious faces, Adelaide felt not shame but a cold, clarifying anger. She had spent 4 months slowly starving herself to keep 11 children alive. She had stolen bread and lived in a cellar and maintained her dignity when everything else had been stripped away. She would not allow these comfortable, well-fed women to reduce her struggle to fodder for their gossip. "I understand your concern," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. "But I assure you, my relationship with the Duke is entirely proper. He has provided shelter for children in desperate need. I serve as their teacher and caretaker. Nothing more, nothing less. If you find something sinister in that arrangement, perhaps the failing is in your imagination rather than in our conduct." The drawing room went very quiet. Lady Margaret's eyes were bright with approval, while Lady Whitmore's face had gone rigid with affront. "Well," the older woman said icily, "I can see that poverty has not taught you proper humility at least." "On the contrary," Adelaide replied, "poverty has taught me to value substance over appearance, and to recognize that true nobility has nothing to do with titles or wealth. A lesson that perhaps bears repeating in present company." When the gentlemen finally rejoined them, the atmosphere in the drawing room could have frozen water. Grayson took one look at the rigid postures and tight smiles, and raised an inquiring eyebrow at his sister. "An enlightening discussion about the nature of charity," Margaret murmured in response. "I believe Miss Fairmont has made quite an impression." Indeed she had. And as the guests finally departed, Adelaide could feel the weight of their speculation following her like a shadow. She had defended herself and her position, but in doing so, she had also made herself a target for society's censure. The question now was whether the Duke of Wycliffe would decide that her presence was more trouble than it was worth. 2 months passed with a swiftness that Adelaide found both comforting and unsettling. The routine they had established at Wycliffe Manor brought a stability that the girls had not known since the school's demolition. Each morning began with lessons in the schoolroom, where Diana now assisted with teaching the younger children. Afternoons were spent in the gardens when weather permitted, or in quiet study when rain kept them indoors. Evenings brought supper in the small dining room that Lady Margaret had designated for their use, followed by reading aloud before bed. Rose had recovered fully from her pneumonia, her cheeks regaining colour, and her laughter returning to brighten their days. The other girls had blossomed as well, no longer bearing the pinched, anxious expressions of children who did not know where their next meal would come from. Even Emma, the shyest of them all, had begun to speak more freely, her drawings growing bolder and more confident with each passing week. Adelaide herself had gained weight, though she was still far from the robust figure she had maintained before the school's closure. Lady Margaret had insisted on providing her with a proper wardrobe, arguing that a teacher should not appear before her students in threadbare gowns. Adelaide had accepted reluctantly, aware that she was already far too indebted to the Wycliffe family. And then there was the Duke himself. Grayson had become a fixture in their daily lives, appearing regularly during lessons, engaging the girls in conversation during their garden time, even reading to the younger ones on occasion. Adelaide had grown accustomed to his presence, though she remained acutely aware of him whenever he entered a room. The way his eyes sought hers across the schoolroom, the slight smile that touched his lips when Diana corrected one of her younger peers with patient firmness, the intensity with which he watched Adelaide demonstrate her teaching methods, as though memorizing every gesture and word. It was during afternoon tea on a particularly fine spring day that Lady Margaret appeared in the doorway of the small parlour they had claimed as their own, carrying a wooden box that appeared quite old. The girls were scattered about the room, some reading, others working on needlework that Margaret had taught them. Adelaide was reviewing Diana's Latin composition when Margaret's arrival drew everyone's attention. "Miss Fairmont," Margaret said, her expression unusually solemn. "Might I speak with you privately? Diana, perhaps you could supervise the younger girls for a moment?" Diana nodded, straightening with the responsibility. "Of course, Lady Margaret." Adelaide followed Margaret to a quieter corner of the room, curiosity and apprehension mingling in her chest. Margaret set the box on a side table and opened it carefully, revealing a collection of yellowed letters tied with faded ribbon. "I was searching through my late mother's belongings this morning," Margaret explained quietly. "She passed 15 years ago, and Father could never bring himself to go through her personal effects. After his death 5 years past, Grayson inherited that duty, but has avoided it as well. I thought perhaps it was time." She withdrew one of the letter bundles. "I found these. They are letters that my brother wrote when he was a child. Letters to someone he addressed only as, 'Dear Miss Catherine.'" Adelaide's breath caught. "My mother." "I believe so, yes." Margaret's voice was gentle. "I remembered you mentioning that your mother had tutored a nobleman's son. And when I saw these, well, the handwriting is clearly Grayson's, though much younger and less practiced. And the content," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "They speak of a child struggling with something he calls the letters that dance and refuse to stay still. A child who felt stupid and worthless until someone showed him that his mind worked differently, not deficiently." With trembling fingers, Adelaide accepted the letter Margaret offered. The handwriting was indeed that of a child, uneven and carefully formed, as though each letter required great effort. She began to read. "Dear Miss Catherine, today you showed me how to use coloured paper to make the words stop jumping. It worked. I read a whole page from the history book without my head hurting. Father still says I am slow, but you say I am not slow, just different. I believe you more than I believe him. You are kind and patient, and you never make me feel stupid. When I am Duke someday, I will make sure every child who struggles like me has a teacher like you. Your grateful student, G.H." Adelaide's eyes burned with tears. He was the boy my mother spoke of, the one she said had a brilliant mind hidden beneath his difficulty with written words. "Dyslexia, I believe it is called now," Margaret said softly. "Though in Grayson's youth, it had no name beyond lazy or simple-minded. Your mother was the only person who understood that his struggles stemmed not from lack of intelligence, but from the way his brain processed information." She touched Adelaide's hand gently. "I think you should speak with him about this. He has been carrying something heavy these past months, ever since you arrived. Perhaps it is time for that burden to be shared." The opportunity came sooner than Adelaide expected. That very afternoon, as the girls worked on their mathematics lessons, Adelaide noticed Grayson standing in his usual spot just inside the doorway. But today, instead of his customary observation, he seemed troubled, his brow furrowed, and his expression distant. "Diana," Adelaide said quietly, "please continue the lesson. I need to speak with His Grace for a moment." She moved into the hallway, gesturing for Grayson to follow her to the library where they could speak privately. Once inside, she closed the door and turned to face him, the letters clutched in her hand. "Lady Margaret found these today," she said without preamble. "Letters you wrote to my mother when you were a child." Grayson's face went very still. "I see. You were her student. The nobleman's son she spoke of with such pride." Adelaide's voice trembled slightly. "The boy who struggled with reading until she developed special methods to help him. I was that boy, yes." Grayson moved to the window, his back to her. "Your mother saved me from a childhood of shame and failure. She taught me that my difficulty with written words did not make me stupid, just different. She gave me methods to manage my struggles, ways to work with my mind rather than against it." He paused, his shoulders tight with tension. "And I repaid that gift by destroying the school where she continued that work." "You did not know," Adelaide said, moving closer. "The purchase was handled through intermediaries. You could not have known what building stood on that land." Grayson turned to face her then, and the anguish in his eyes took her breath away. "I should have known. That is the point, Adelaide. I should have read the documents more carefully, should have investigated what I was purchasing. But I skimmed them, as I always do with dense legal text, because even after all these years, reading still requires more effort than I care to admit. My disability, the very thing your mother helped me overcome, led directly to the destruction of her legacy." The vulnerability in his admission shattered something in Adelaide's carefully maintained composure. She closed the distance between them, placing her hand on his arm. You did not overcome it, Grayson. You learned to manage it, to work around it. But it is still part of you, and it always will be. My mother would not have blamed you for that. Perhaps not, he said roughly, but I blame myself. Do you know what it has been like, watching you teach these girls using the same methods your mother used with me? Seeing Diana struggle with a difficult text, and watching you show her exactly how to break it into manageable pieces. Every lesson is a reminder of what I destroyed through my own carelessness. Before Adelaide could respond, a sound from the doorway made them both turn. Diana stood there, her face pale, with Mary and Charlotte behind her. They had clearly heard enough to understand what was being discussed. "Your Grace," Diana said, her voice steady despite her evident emotion. "You think you destroyed Miss Catherine's legacy by closing the school. But you did not. The legacy is not in the building. It is in Miss Adelaide, who learned from her mother and continues to teach us. It is in the methods that help us learn when other teachers would give up on us. It is in you, who learned despite everyone telling you that you could not." She moved into the room, the other girls following. "And now it is in this house, where 11 girls who would have been forgotten are being educated and cared for. You did not destroy the legacy, Your Grace. You saved it." The wisdom in those words, coming from a 14-year-old who had known so much hardship, seemed to strike Grayson with physical force. He sank into a chair, covering his face with his hands. Adelaide wanted to go to him, to offer comfort, but before she could move, little Rose had darted forward and climbed onto his lap. "Do not be sad," the small girl said, patting his cheek with her tiny hand. "Miss Adelaide says that mistakes only matter if we do not learn from them. You learned, did you not? You brought us here. You made Rose better when she was sick. You are a good Duke, even if the letters dance for you." Grayson pulled the child close, and Adelaide saw his shoulders shake with emotion he could no longer contain. The other girls gathered around him, offering comfort with the innocent generosity of children who understood suffering and had learned to be gentle with it. Adelaide felt tears stream down her own face as she watched this powerful man, this Duke, who commanded such wealth and influence, brought to tears by the forgiveness of children and the weight of a guilt he had been carrying in silence. The moment was interrupted by a commotion from the entrance hall. Voices raised in greeting as a new arrival made herself known. Lady Margaret appeared in the library doorway, her expression apologetic. "I am sorry to interrupt," she said, "but we have a guest. Lady Cordelia Winters has arrived for the season and has come to pay her respects." Adelaide saw Grayson straighten immediately, wiping his face and composing himself with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to hiding his emotions. "Show her to the drawing room," he instructed. "I will join her presently." After Margaret departed, he turned to Adelaide and the girls. "Thank you," he said simply, "for your understanding, for your forgiveness, for continuing your mother's work despite everything." His gaze lingered on Adelaide. "We will speak more of this later. For now, I must attend to my guest." Lady Cordelia Winters proved to be everything Adelaide was not. Tall, elegantly dressed, with golden hair and the sort of confident beauty that came from never knowing want or insecurity. She was a widow, Margaret quietly informed Adelaide, whose late husband had been the Earl of Haverford. Childless and wealthy, she had returned to society after her year of mourning, with clear intentions regarding the Duke of Wycliffe. Adelaide encountered her for the first time at a charity event in the village the following week. Lady Margaret had insisted that Adelaide attend, arguing that as the teacher of the children now residing at Wycliffe, she should be introduced to the local society in a formal capacity. The event was held in the assembly rooms, a modest building that served as the social centre for the area. Tables had been set up displaying various handcrafted items for sale, with proceeds going to support the local parish poor fund. Adelaide had brought several of the older girls with her, thinking it would be educational for them to see how such charitable efforts were organised. They had been examining a display of embroidered handkerchiefs when a clear, carrying voice cut through the ambient conversation. "How quaint," Lady Cordelia said, loud enough to be heard by half the room. "The Duke's latest charity project on display. Tell me, Miss Fairmont, is it true that you were found stealing from his kitchen? What a romantic beginning to your current arrangement." The room fell silent. Adelaide felt every eye turned toward her, felt the weight of judgment and speculation. Beside her, Diana stiffened with anger, while Mary's hand found hers and squeezed tightly. Adelaide forced herself to turn calmly, to meet Lady Cordelia's gaze with steady composure. "I was indeed found taking bread from the Duke's kitchen, my lady. I make no excuse for the theft beyond necessity. The children under my care were hungry, and I had exhausted all proper channels of assistance." "How very noble," Cordelia replied, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Though one must wonder if desperation truly explains your continued residence at Wycliffe Manor. There are, after all, workhouses and parish homes for such situations. Yet here you remain, ensconced in the Duke's household with remarkable permanence." The implication was clear, and Adelaide felt heat rise to her face. Before she could formulate a response that would not make the situation worse, a small voice piped up beside her. "Miss Adelaide stays because we need her," Rose said, her recovered health giving her voice surprising strength for such a small child. "She takes care of us. She teaches us. She loves us. And the Duke is kind to let us stay, because that is what good people do. They help when someone needs help." The simple, innocent defense somehow made the situation even more uncomfortable. Lady Cordelia's expression hardened as she looked down at the small girl who had dared to contradict her. "How charming," she said coldly. "The Duke has acquired not only a resident charity case but an entire collection of them, complete with a spokesman. I am certain society will find this arrangement most interesting." Adelaide felt Diana move forward protectively, saw Mary's face flush with anger, and knew she needed to remove the girls from this situation before it deteriorated further. "If you will excuse us, Lady Cordelia, we have other displays to view." "Of course," Cordelia replied, her smile sharp as broken glass. "Do enjoy the event, though I wonder if your presence here might make some of our other patrons uncomfortable. Charity is best received with proper humility, after all." As Adelaide guided the girls away, she heard the whispers that followed them, felt the weight of speculation and disapproval. She had been naive to think that the local society would accept her position at Wycliffe without question. Lady Cordelia had simply given voice to what many were already thinking. That evening, as she put the younger girls to bed, Adelaide found herself reflecting on the day's events. The discovery of Grayson's letters to her mother, the vulnerable moment in the library, and then the very public confrontation with Lady Cordelia. Each event had exposed something she had been trying to ignore. Her position at Wycliffe was precarious at best, potentially scandalous at worst, and there was something else she could no longer deny. Somewhere in the past 2 months, her feelings for Grayson Hartley had evolved from gratitude to something far more complicated and dangerous. She admired his intelligence, his hidden kindness, the way he engaged with the children despite his busy schedule. She treasured the moments when his guard dropped and she glimpsed the vulnerable man beneath the ducal facade. But such feelings were foolish beyond measure. She was a penniless viscount's daughter, with no dowry, and a reputation now thoroughly tarnished by her circumstances. He was a duke who would eventually need to marry someone like Lady Cordelia, someone who could bring political connections and social advantage to the match. "Miss Adelaide," Diana's voice came from the doorway. The girl should have been in bed, but Adelaide could see from her expression that sleep would not come easily tonight. "What Lady Cordelia said today about you using us to secure your position here, it is not true, is it? You are here because of us, not because of the Duke?" Adelaide drew the girl into her arms, holding her close. "I am here because you need me, Diana. You and Mary and Rose and all the others. Everything I have done, everything I will do, is for your welfare, not for any other reason. But you care for him," Diana observed with the uncomfortable perceptiveness of adolescence. "For the Duke. I have seen how you look at each other when you think no one is watching." Adelaide could not deny it. Not to this girl who had learned to read adult emotions through years of observing those who held power over her life. "What I feel does not matter," she said quietly. "The Duke will marry someone suitable, someone like Lady Cordelia. And when that happens, we will need to find another situation. But until then, We make the most of this opportunity to learn and grow stronger." Diana pulled back, her young face set with determination. "Then we had better learn everything we can, as quickly as we can. Because if Lady Cordelia has her way, our time here may be shorter than we hoped." It was a sobering thought, and one that kept Adelaide awake long into the night. She had known their situation at Wycliffe could not last forever, but she had not expected it to be threatened quite so soon. Lady Cordelia's public confrontation had been a warning shot, a demonstration of the social power she could wield. And Adelaide, for all her education and dignity, had no weapons with which to fight back. In his study, Grayson sat alone with a glass of brandy he did not drink, his mind replaying the events of the day, the discovery of his childhood letters, Adelaide's gentle understanding, the children's unexpected forgiveness, and then Lady Cordelia's calculated cruelty at the charity event, which Lady Margaret had reported to him in detailed outrage. He had known that his decision to house Adelaide and the children would raise eyebrows, but he had underestimated how viciously society would attack a woman who had no powerful family to defend her. Lady Cordelia had clearly decided that Adelaide represented an obstacle to her matrimonial ambitions, and she intended to remove that obstacle through systematic social destruction. What Cordelia did not understand, what perhaps even Adelaide herself did not fully comprehend, was that Grayson's feelings had progressed far beyond mere gratitude or obligation. He had fallen in love with Adelaide Fairmont, with her fierce protection of her students, her quiet dignity in the face of hardship, her brilliant mind and patient teaching methods, with the way she had looked at him in the library, not with pity for his disability, but with understanding and acceptance. But loving her and being able to marry her were two very different things. As a duke, his marriage would impact not just himself, but his family's political alliances, his sister's social standing, the future of his estates. A marriage to someone like Adelaide, a penniless educator with a questionable living situation, would cause scandal that could reverberate for years. And yet, watching her walk away from Lady Cordelia's attack, with her head held high and her students gathered protectively around her, Grayson had felt something shift fundamentally within him. Some understanding that the social consequences, however severe, mattered less than the prospect of losing this woman who had brought light and purpose back into his carefully controlled life. The question was not whether he loved Adelaide Fairmont. The question was whether he had the courage to act on that love, knowing it would cost him dearly in the eyes of society. It was a question that would demand an answer far sooner than he anticipated. The rumours began subtly, as such things always did in polite society. A comment here about the peculiar arrangement at Wycliffe Manor. A raised eyebrow there at the mention of Miss Fairmont's continued residence. Within a week of Lady Cordelia's public confrontation at the charity event, the whispers had grown into open speculation that reached even Adelaide's ears through the sympathetic warnings of servants who had grown fond of the children. Lady Cordelia, it seemed, had taken her investigation of Adelaide's background quite seriously. She had discovered that Viscount Fairmont had not simply died in financial difficulties, but had lost his entire fortune through ill-advised speculation in shipping ventures that had failed spectacularly. The debts had been substantial enough that Adelaide's mother had been forced to sell even their family home to satisfy creditors. Every detail of the Fairmont family's financial ruin was being shared with relish throughout the drawing rooms of the county. "They are saying," Lady Margaret reported grimly during a private conversation in Adelaide's sitting room, "that your father's poor judgment extends to his daughter, that you have engineered this entire situation to secure a position in my brother's household, using the children as pawns to play upon his sympathies." Adelaide felt the blood drain from her face. "That is a monstrous accusation." "Yes, well, monstrous accusations are Lady Cordelia's particular talent," Margaret replied, her expression tight with anger. "She has also been spreading the suggestion that allowing 11 children of questionable parentage to reside in a duke's household sets a dangerous precedent. Several influential members of the local gentry have begun questioning whether Grayson's judgment has been compromised by inappropriate sentiments. The implication was clear, and Adelaide's hands trembled as she set down her teacup. Perhaps it would be better if the children and I sought other accommodations. I never intended to bring scandal to your family's name. You have brought nothing but good to this household, Margaret said fiercely. Those children were dying, Adelaide. My brother did what any decent person should do. If society chooses to see scandal in that, the fault lies with them, not with you. But the pressure continued to mount. 3 days later, Reverend Whitmore himself called upon Grayson, a visit that Adelaide learned about from Mrs. Hughes, who had served tea during the interview and reported the conversation to Lady Margaret in shocked tones. The Reverend suggested, Margaret told Adelaide that evening, her voice shaking with fury, that housing these children without proper oversight from the church or parish authorities was irregular at best, potentially criminal at worst. He implied that my brother might be investigated for improper conduct regarding vulnerable children. Adelaide pressed a hand to her mouth, horrified. But that is absurd. The Duke has been nothing but proper. The children adore him. There has never been a moment of inappropriate behaviour. Truth matters little when reputation is at stake, Margaret replied bitterly. Whitmore also mentioned that several members of the parish council have expressed concerns about the nature of your relationship with Grayson. They find it suspicious that a penniless woman would be given such comfortable accommodations, such fine clothing, such apparent favour from a duke who has shown no previous interest in charitable works. That night, unable to sleep, Adelaide stood at her window watching moonlight silver the gardens below. She had been naive to think their situation could continue indefinitely without consequences. She was a woman alone, living under the roof of an unmarried duke, caring for children who had no legal protection beyond his goodwill. In society's eyes, the arrangement was scandalous, no matter how innocent the reality. The following afternoon brought the confrontation Adelaide had been dreading. She was supervising the children's afternoon lessons when Mrs. Hughes appeared at the schoolroom door, her expression troubled. Miss Fairmont, you have a visitor. Lady Cordelia Winters has called and requests a private audience with you. Adelaide felt her stomach clench, but she kept her voice steady. Very well. Diana, please continue with the geography lesson. I shall return shortly. Lady Cordelia waited in the small morning room, standing by the window with the light behind her like a golden-haired angel. But there was nothing angelic in her expression as Adelaide entered and closed the door behind her. Miss Fairmont, Cordelia said without preamble, I shall be direct, as I believe we understand each other well enough to dispense with pleasantries. Your presence at Wycliffe Manor has become untenable. I was not aware that you had authority to make such determinations regarding the Duke's household, Adelaide replied, keeping her tone carefully neutral. Cordelia's smile was cold. I have no authority over the Duke's decisions, but I do have significant influence with the parish council, the local magistrate, and several members of the county gentry whose opinions matter a great deal. And I have been making inquiries about the legal status of those children you claim to protect. Adelaide felt ice form in her veins. What sort of inquiries? The children have no legal guardian, Cordelia said, moving closer with predatory grace. You have no formal custody, no legal right to make decisions regarding their welfare. They are, in the eyes of the law, unclaimed orphans who should be under the supervision of the parish authorities. She paused, letting that information settle. I have been speaking with Magistrate Pemberton. He has expressed concern that these children are being kept in what might be considered irregular circumstances, without proper oversight, without church approval, under the roof of an unmarried duke and a woman of questionable reputation. My reputation was perfectly sound until you began attacking it, Adelaide said, fighting to keep her voice level despite the fear clawing at her throat. Your reputation, Cordelia corrected sharply, was destroyed the moment you chose to live in poverty rather than seeking appropriate employment. A viscount's daughter, reduced to stealing bread and squatting in cellars. You have made choices that place you outside the bounds of respectable society, Miss Fairmont. The consequences of those choices are not my doing. Adelaide's hands clenched in her skirts. What do you want? I want you to leave Wycliffe Manor, Cordelia stated flatly. Take your children and find accommodations elsewhere. I understand you have a cousin in Derby. Go there. Remove yourself from the Duke's household and from his life. Do so quietly, without drama, and I will ensure that the parish does not pursue the question of the children's legal status too aggressively. And if I refuse? Adelaide asked, though she already knew the answer. Cordelia's expression hardened. Then I will use every connection I possess to have those children removed from your care and placed in parish workhouses where they belong. Separated, of course, as is customary. Sent to different facilities. Diana is old enough to be put to work in a factory. The younger ones can be placed in orphanages or hired out as servants. That little Rose you are so fond of would make a suitable scullery maid once she is properly broken of any pretensions to education. The casual cruelty of it struck Adelaide like a physical blow. You would destroy children's lives simply to remove me from proximity to the Duke. I would protect my interests, Cordelia corrected. The Duke needs a wife who can advance his political connections and maintain his social standing. You offer him nothing but scandal and obligation. It is only a matter of time before he realizes this and asks you to leave himself. I am simply expediting the inevitable while offering you a more graceful exit than you might otherwise receive. And if the Duke objects to my departure? Cordelia laughed, a brittle sound devoid of humour. The Duke is a practical man, Miss Fairmont. When faced with the choice between defending a penniless teacher and protecting his family's reputation, he will choose the latter. Men of his station always do. She moved toward the door, then paused. You have 3 days to make arrangements. After that, I will proceed with my inquiries to the magistrate regardless of your decision. The only question is whether you leave with the children intact as a group, or whether they are scattered to the winds. Choose wisely. After Cordelia departed, Adelaide sat alone in the morning room for a long time, her mind racing through impossible options. She could tell Grayson, but what could he do? Challenge the magistrate's authority? Create a public confrontation that would only draw more attention to their situation? Even if he succeeded in maintaining custody of the children, the scandal would follow him for years, damaging his political influence and his family's standing. She reached for pen and paper with hands that would not quite steady. The note she wrote was brief and factual. Lady Cordelia Winters had threatened the magistrate, and the girls would be the ones punished if anyone hesitated. Adelaide sealed it, sent a footman to the stables, and ordered him to find the Duke wherever he had ridden. The servants could only say that Grayson had gone out before luncheon, steward's business, then a meeting with Phillips, and no one could promise her an hour of his return. Cordelia had said 3 days. In Adelaide's bones, it felt like fewer. She could refuse to leave and call Cordelia's bluff, but the risk was too great. If the woman truly did have the magistrate's ear, she could make good on her threats. The children would be taken, separated, sent to institutions where their education would end and their futures would narrow to nothing more than servitude. Or she could do as Cordelia demanded. Leave quietly. Take the children to her cousin in Derby and hope to find some way to support them there, away from the luxury and security they had known at Wycliffe. That evening, Adelaide began making quiet preparations. She spoke to Mrs. Hughes about which belongings the children could reasonably take, made discreet inquiries about the cost of coach fare to Derby, wrote a careful letter to her cousin explaining the situation and requesting temporary shelter. She told herself she was simply exploring options, preparing for contingencies. But in her heart, she knew she had already made her decision. The children must come first. They always had. And if protecting them meant leaving Grayson, meant walking away from the only place that had felt like home in years, then that was what she would do. It was Diana who discovered her packing. The girl appeared in Adelaide's doorway late that evening, her eyes wide with alarm at the sight of clothing being folded and placed in a travelling case. "We are leaving," Diana said flatly. It was not a question. Adelaide's hands stilled on the chemise she had been folding. "I am making contingency plans." "You are running away." Diana moved into the room, her young face set with anger and hurt. "Someone threatened us, and instead of fighting, you are running away." "I am protecting you," Adelaide corrected, her voice rougher than intended. "There are forces at work here that I cannot control, Diana. Legal matters, social pressures. If we stay, You and the other girls could be taken from me and separated, sent to different workhouses, different families. I cannot allow that to happen. So instead, you will take us away from the only real home we have known. Diana's voice cracked with emotion. Away from warm beds and full meals and lessons that might actually give us futures. Away from the Duke, who has been kinder to us than anyone except you. I am doing what I must to keep you all together, Adelaide said, blinking back tears. That is all that matters. What about what you want? Diana demanded. What about the Duke? Anyone with eyes can see that you care for each other. Are you truly going to walk away from that without even fighting for it? Before Adelaide could answer, a throat cleared from the doorway. Lady Margaret stood there, her expression grave. I thought I heard voices. Diana, perhaps you should return to your room. I need to speak with Miss Fairmont privately. Diana hesitated, then nodded stiffly and left. Margaret closed the door behind her and moved to sit on the edge of Adelaide's bed, regarding the half-packed trunk with resigned understanding. Cordelia came to see you, Margaret stated, and made threats regarding the children's legal status. How did you know? Because I know Cordelia, Margaret replied bitterly, and because I have seen that haunted look before. In the eyes of other women she has crushed to secure what she wants. She reached out and took Adelaide's hand. You cannot leave without speaking to Grayson first. He deserves to know what has transpired. What good would it do? Adelaide asked, her voice breaking. He cannot fight the magistrate's authority without creating exactly the sort of scandal that would damage everything he has worked to build. If I leave quietly, the situation resolves itself. Cordelia gets what she wants, the children remain safe, and the Duke's reputation stays intact. And what about your heart? Margaret asked gently. What about his? Adelaide pulled her hand away, turning to stare out the window at the moonlit gardens. Hearts heal, but children whose lives are destroyed by being separated and sent to workhouses do not get second chances. I will not gamble with their futures simply because I have developed inappropriate feelings for your brother. There is nothing inappropriate about loving him, Margaret said softly, and nothing inappropriate about him loving you, which he does, whether either of you has admitted it aloud. Love is not enough, Adelaide replied, though each word felt like glass in her throat. Not against the weight of social expectation and legal authority. I am a realist, Margaret. I have had to be. And the reality is that I cannot fight this battle and win. The best I can do is leave before the children pay the price for my stubbornness. They were interrupted by a knock at the door. Mrs. Hughes appeared, her expression apologetic. Miss Fairmont, the Duke has requested your presence in the library. He says it is urgent. Adelaide's stomach dropped. Somehow he had learned of her plans. Perhaps Diana had gone to him, or perhaps servants' gossip had travelled faster than she had anticipated. Either way, she could no longer avoid the confrontation she had been dreading. She found Grayson in the library, standing by the fire with his back to the door. He did not turn as she entered, though he must have heard her footsteps on the marble floor. Diana informs me that you are planning to leave, he said, his voice carefully controlled. Is this true? Yes, Adelaide replied, seeing no point in denial. We will depart for Derby in 3 days' time. My cousin has agreed to provide temporary shelter while I seek employment. Employment? Grayson turned then, and the pain in his eyes nearly undid her resolve. After everything, you would simply leave, without a word to me, without a discussion of alternatives. There are no alternatives, Adelaide said, fighting to keep her voice steady. Lady Cordelia has made it clear that she intends to pursue legal action regarding the children's status if I do not remove myself from your household. She has connections with the magistrate. She can make good on her threats. And you believe I am incapable of protecting you? Grayson's voice held an edge of anger now. That I would allow someone like Cordelia to dictate what happens under my own roof? I believe you are a duke with responsibilities that extend beyond one impoverished teacher and 11 orphaned children, Adelaide replied, her own anger rising to meet his. I believe that fighting this battle would cost you dearly in terms of political capital and social standing. I believe that Cordelia is correct when she says you will eventually need to marry someone who can advance your family's interests, not damage them further. So you have decided for both of us, Grayson said bitterly. Just as I once decided for myself that I had no right to burden you with my disability and my guilt. We are both cowards, it seems, hiding behind practical considerations rather than fighting for what we truly want. The accusation stung because it was partially true. What I want does not matter, Adelaide said, her voice breaking despite her best efforts. What matters is that Diana and Rose and all the others remain safe and together. If leaving here accomplishes that, then I will leave. My feelings are irrelevant. Your feelings are irrelevant, Grayson repeated, moving toward her with sudden intensity. And what of mine? Do they count for nothing? I have spent 2 months watching you bring light and purpose back into my life, watching you teach with methods my mother would have recognized, methods that saved me from a childhood of misery. Falling in love with your strength and your dedication, and your refusal to compromise your principles, even when doing so, would be easier. He stood before her now, close enough that she could see the anguish in his eyes. And now you would leave without giving me any say in the matter, without trusting me to find a solution. There is no solution, Adelaide whispered, tears streaming down her face now. Do you not see? Even if you could protect the children's legal status, even if you could weather the social scandal, you are a duke. You need a wife who can support your political ambitions, who can manage your social obligations, who can bring valuable connections to your family. I am none of those things. I am a penniless teacher with a tarnished reputation and 11 children dependent upon my care. You are the woman I love, Grayson said, his voice rough with emotion. Everything else is negotiable. Love is not enough, Adelaide repeated, though her heart was breaking with each word. Not in your world. You will realize that eventually, and when you do, the children and I will already be gone, sparing everyone the pain of a more difficult goodbye. She turned to leave, unable to bear the pain in his eyes any longer. But his voice stopped her at the door. If you leave, Adelaide, I will not chase you. I will respect your decision, no matter how much it costs me. But know this, you are not protecting me by running away. You are simply teaching me that love, even when freely given and honestly meant, is not enough to overcome your fear. Adelaide fled then, unable to formulate a response that would not reveal just how close she was to changing her mind. She reached her room and sank onto her bed, burying her face in her hands as sobs tore through her. Outside her door, she heard soft footsteps. The children had gathered, drawn by the sounds of her crying. Rose's small voice came through the wood. Miss Adelaide, we do not want to go. We want to stay here. Oh, we will find another home, Adelaide called back, though the words tasted like ash. I promise, everything will be all right. But as she lay awake that long night, listening to the manor settle into silence around her, Adelaide wondered if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She was doing what she thought was right, what would protect the children and preserve Grayson's future. But Diana's accusation echoed in her mind. Are you truly going to walk away from that without even fighting for it? The answer, it seemed, was yes, because fighting meant risking everything, and Adelaide had learned long ago that when you had nothing, you could not afford to gamble what little remained, even if what remained was the only chance at happiness she had known in years. Dawn broke cold and grey over Wycliffe Manor as 2 carriages waited in the circular drive, their horses stamping impatiently in the morning chill. Adelaide stood on the front steps, watching as servants loaded the last of their meagre belongings, her heart heavy with a grief she could not fully express. Around her, the 11 girls huddled together in their travelling cloaks, their faces reflecting confusion and fear at this sudden upheaval. Mrs. Hughes appeared with a basket of provisions for the journey, her own eyes red from crying. Fresh bread and cheese, miss. Some apples and cold meat. It is a long journey to Derby, and the children will need proper sustenance. Thank you, Adelaide managed, her throat tight. For everything. Your kindness has meant more than you know. The housekeeper pressed the basket into her hands, and then, surprising Adelaide, pulled her into a fierce embrace. You are making a mistake, leaving like this. His Grace has been in his study all night, and he looks like a man whose heart is breaking. Sometimes breaking hearts is kinder than destroying futures, Adelaide whispered, pulling away before her resolve could crumble entirely. Diana approached, her young face set with stubborn anger. I still think we should stay. I think we should fight. We have discussed this, Adelaide replied gently but firmly. The decision is made. Come, help me get the younger girls settled in the carriage. The process of loading 11 children into 2 carriages was chaotic, despite Adelaide's best efforts at organisation. Rose clung to her skirts, crying softly. Emma refused to let go of the doll she had been given by one of the maids. Mary clutched her precious books, as though they might be taken from her at any moment. Charlotte kept looking back at the manor house, as though memorising every detail. As Adelaide was about to climb into the first carriage, Lady Margaret emerged from the house, still in her dressing gown, her hair loose around her shoulders. Wait, she called, hurrying down the steps. Please, Adelaide, do not do this. Give my brother a chance to make this right. There is no making this right, Adelaide replied, though her voice lacked conviction. The social pressures, the legal threats, these are not problems that can be solved through good intentions. You underestimate him, Margaret insisted, catching Adelaide's arm. And you underestimate how much you mean to him. He spent the entire night in his study, and when I looked in on him this morning, he was surrounded by legal documents, letters to solicitors, correspondence with members of Parliament. He is fighting for you, Adelaide. Will you not at least give him the chance to succeed? Adelaide felt tears burn her eyes. If he succeeds, it will cost him dearly. His reputation, his political influence, perhaps even his standing in society. I cannot be the cause of such destruction. And if you leave, what will it cost him? Margaret challenged. His heart, his happiness. The opportunity for the kind of love that most people only dream of finding. She glanced at the carriages where the girls watched anxiously through the windows. What will it cost those children who have finally found stability and hope? You think you are protecting them by leaving, but you are teaching them that when circumstances become difficult, the answer is to run rather than fight. The words struck Adelaide with painful accuracy, echoing what Diana had said the night before. But before she could formulate a response, the distant sound of a door slamming drew their attention. Grayson stood at the top of the steps, still dressed in the same clothes he had worn the previous evening, his hair dishevelled and his face haggard. For a long moment, their eyes met across the distance. Adelaide saw anguish there, and anger, and something that looked very much like defeat. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared back into the house. The sight of his retreat, his apparent acceptance of her departure, somehow hurt worse than any argument would have. Adelaide climbed into the carriage with mechanical movements, settling Rose on her lap and arranging the other girls around her. The driver clicked to the horses, and the carriages began their slow progress down the long drive. Adelaide did not look back. She could not bear to see Wycliffe Manor receding behind them, could not allow herself to second-guess the decision she had made. Instead, she focused on the children, answering their anxious questions about what awaited them in Derby, painting a picture of their future that she desperately hoped might prove true. The journey was long and uncomfortable. The roads were rutted from recent rains, making the carriage lurch and sway. They stopped twice to rest the horses and allow the children to stretch their legs, but Adelaide hurried them back into the carriages as quickly as propriety allowed, driven by an irrational fear that if they delayed too long, something might prevent them from reaching their destination. Inside the carriage, conversation gradually died away as exhaustion claimed the younger girls. Diana remained awake, staring out the window with an expression that made Adelaide's heart ache. The girl had barely spoken since their departure, her disappointment and anger creating a barrier between them that Adelaide did not know how to breach. "I know you are upset with me," Adelaide said quietly, careful not to wake the sleeping children. "But please try to understand. Everything I do to protect you. All of you." Diana turned from the window, her eyes hard. "You taught us that education was the only inheritance that could not be taken by poverty or circumstance. You taught us to stand up for ourselves, to fight for what we believed was right. And now, when you had the chance to practice what you preached, you ran away instead." The accusation stung because it was true. "There are times when discretion is the better part of valor," Adelaide replied weakly. "That is what adults say when they are too frightened to fight. Diana shot back. Then her expression crumbled, and tears began to stream down her face. I loved it there. We all did. For the first time in my life, I was not just surviving, but actually living. Learning things that might give me a real future. And you took it away. Adelaide pulled the girl into her arms, holding her as she sobbed. I am sorry, she whispered. I am so sorry. But I promise you, we will find another way. We will rebuild. We always do. But even as she spoke the words, Adelaide wondered if she was lying to them both. Back at Wycliffe Manor, Grayson sat in his study, surrounded by the legal documents and correspondence that had consumed his night. He had written to every solicitor he knew, every member of Parliament who owed him favours, every influential contact who might help him navigate the legal complexities of securing formal guardianship for 11 orphaned children. He had drafted letters challenging the magistrate's authority, composed careful arguments about the rights of property owners to provide shelter as they saw fit, researched precedents for noble families taking in children who were not blood relations. But in the end, all his efforts had crumbled against one simple truth. Adelaide was leaving because she believed it was best for the children. And he, who had once made the same choice to push away someone he cared for in the name of protection, could not in good conscience tell her she was wrong. The knock at his door barely registered. He did not look up when it opened, assuming it was a servant come to collect the cold breakfast he had not touched. Grayson. Margaret's voice was sharp enough to cut through his stupor. You are going to sit here and let her go? After everything? After spending the entire night working on solutions, you are simply going to give up? She made her choice, Grayson replied dully. The same choice I made when I pushed her mother's school off my property through negligence. The same choice I have made my entire life when faced with difficult situations, to prioritize safety over courage, isolation over vulnerability. Margaret moved into the room and deliberately swept half the papers off his desk onto the floor. Stop wallowing in your guilt and go after her, you fool. Do you think Mother would have wanted you to spend your life alone because you are too frightened to fight for what you want? Do you think Catherine Fairmont taught you to read just so you could hide behind your disability when circumstances became challenging? This is not about me, Grayson protested. This is about Adelaide and the children, about protecting them from the social consequences of associating with me. No, Margaret said fiercely. This is about you being terrified of being rejected again. Terrified that if you put your heart on the line, she will choose to leave anyway, and you will be left with the knowledge that even your love was not enough. She leaned across the desk, her eyes blazing. Catherine Fairmont spent months teaching you that your worth was not determined by your struggles with reading, that you were not stupid or lazy or deficient, just different. She taught you to have courage when everyone else told you to accept your limitations. And now her daughter, who has shown that same courage every day of her life despite circumstances that would have broken most people, is leaving because she thinks she is protecting you. Oh, what would you have me do? Grayson demanded, rising from his chair. Ride after them? Make some grand gesture? Force her to stay when she has made it clear that leaving is what she believes is right? Yes, Margaret said simply. Ride after them, make that grand gesture, and for once in your carefully controlled life, tell the woman you love that you are choosing her over your reputation, over your comfort, over your fear. Show Adelaide that you trust her enough to let her make an informed decision based on honesty rather than her own fears about being a burden. Grayson stared at his sister, her words echoing in his mind. She was right. He had spent his entire life hiding his vulnerability, protecting himself behind walls of propriety and social expectations. Even his relationship with Adelaide had been characterized by observation from a distance, by careful control of his emotions. He had never been truly honest with her about the depth of his feelings, about his willingness to weather any scandal if it meant having her in his life. And now she was leaving, making a choice based on incomplete information, because he had been too frightened to lay his heart bare. How long ago did they leave? He asked abruptly. Margaret's face brightened with hope. Perhaps an hour, maybe less. If you ride hard, you can catch them before they reach the first coaching inn. Grayson was already moving toward the door. Have Philip saddle Tempest and send a messenger to my solicitor in Derby. I want him to meet me at the Rose and Crown Inn by this evening." "What are you planning?" Margaret called after him. "To stop hiding," Grayson replied, "and to fight for what I should have fought for from the beginning." Within 15 minutes, Grayson was mounted on his fastest horse, riding north along the road to Derby with single-minded determination. The morning had turned blustery, with clouds gathering overhead that promised rain before nightfall, but he paid them no mind. His entire focus was on closing the distance between himself and the woman he loved. The countryside passed in a blur as Tempest ate up the miles with powerful strides. Grayson's mind raced ahead, planning what he would say, how he would convince Adelaide that her fears about damaging his reputation were groundless compared to the reality of living without her. He would tell her about the letters he had written, the legal protections he had set in motion for the children. He would admit publicly, if necessary, to the dyslexia he had spent his entire adult life hiding. He would do whatever it took to show her that she was more important than any social consequence. It was mid-afternoon when he finally spotted the 2 carriages ahead, pulling into the courtyard of a modest inn on the outskirts of a small village. The sign proclaimed it the Rose and Crown, and the courtyard was busy with other travellers seeking respite from the threatening weather. Grayson dismounted in a flurry of motion, tossing Tempest's reins to a startled stable boy. The inn's common room was crowded with travellers, farmers, and local merchants seeking their midday meal. And there, just inside the door, stood Adelaide with her 11 girls clustered around her, looking exhausted and overwhelmed. The room fell silent as Grayson entered, his dishevelled appearance and noble bearing creating an immediate stir. Adelaide turned at the sudden quiet, her eyes widening with shock as she saw him standing there. "Your Grace," she whispered. "What are you doing here?" "Stopping you from making the biggest mistake of both our lives," Grayson replied, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent room. "And doing something I should have done 2 months ago." He moved through the crowded room until he stood directly before her, acutely aware of every eye watching them, every ear straining to hear what would be said. The children pressed close to Adelaide, their faces reflecting hope and fear in equal measure. "I love you," Grayson said simply, letting the truth ring out for everyone to hear. "I have loved you since the night I found you stealing bread to feed these children. I have loved you watching you teach with the same methods your mother used to save me from a childhood of misery. I have loved you for your strength and your courage and your refusal to compromise your principles, even when doing so would make your life easier." "Grayson," Adelaide began, her voice trembling. "We discussed this. The scandal, the social consequences, will pale in comparison to spending the rest of my life without you." He interrupted. "You think you are protecting me by leaving, but you are wrong. You are teaching these girls that love is not worth fighting for, that when society pressures us to choose between what is right and what is proper, we should always choose propriety." Around them, the crowd had grown larger as people from the courtyard pressed inside to witness the scene unfolding. Adelaide's face had gone pale, her hands trembling as she gripped Rose's shoulders. "What about Lady Cordelia's threats?" she asked. "The magistrate, the legal questions about the children." "I have spent the night securing their futures," Grayson replied. "Legal guardianship papers are being drawn up as we speak. I am establishing a formal charitable trust to support the continuation of your mother's educational methods, with you as its director. The school will be rebuilt, properly funded and protected by legal charter. But none of that matters if you are not there to run it, if you are not there to share my life." Tears were streaming down Adelaide's face now. "You would risk everything for us? Your reputation? Your standing in society?" "My reputation means nothing without you," Grayson said, and then he did something he had never done in his life. He dropped to one knee before her, in front of dozens of witnesses, and spoke the truth he had hidden for so long. "I have dyslexia. I struggle to read even now, years after your mother taught me techniques to manage it. It is a disability I have hidden my entire adult life out of shame and fear of being judged deficient." Gasps echoed through the room. Adelaide's hand flew to her mouth. "But your mother taught me that my worth was not determined by my struggles," Grayson continued, his voice strong despite the vulnerability of his confession. She taught me to have courage when everyone else told me to accept my limitations. And now I am asking you to have that same courage, to choose love over fear, to trust that together we can weather whatever scandal or hardship comes our way." He reached for her hand, holding it gently. "Adelaide Fairmont, will you marry me? Will you help me continue your mother's legacy? Will you let these children have the home and education they deserve? Will you give me the chance to prove that love, when freely given and honestly meant, is enough to overcome any obstacle society places in our path?" The silence in the room was absolute. Every eye was fixed on Adelaide's face, watching as tears continued to stream down her cheeks. Then, from behind her, Diana's voice rang out clear and strong. "Say yes, Miss Adelaide, for all of us. Say yes and teach us that fighting for what we love is worth more than running away from our fears." Adelaide looked down at the girl who had become like a daughter to her, then at the other 10 faces watching with desperate hope. Finally, her gaze returned to Grayson, kneeling before her in public humiliation and private courage, offering her everything he had, despite knowing it might not be enough. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, I will marry you. I will continue my mother's work. I will fight beside you for these children and for the future we can build together." The room erupted in cheers and applause as Grayson rose and pulled Adelaide into his arms, uncaring of propriety or social convention. Rose began to cry. Then Emma. Then all the girls were clustering around them, their arms wrapping around both adults in a tangle of joy and relief. "But I have a condition," Adelaide said, pulling back slightly to meet Grayson's eyes. "The school we rebuild, it must be a formal institution, legally protected and properly funded, not dependent on your goodwill alone, but established as a permanent legacy that will continue regardless of what happens to either of us." "Already arranged," Grayson replied, smiling for what felt like the first time in days. "The trust documents are being prepared. You will have complete autonomy over the curriculum and admissions. The Catherine Fairmont School for Girls will open its doors within 6 months, with you as its headmistress, and these 11 as its first students." Adelaide pressed her face against his chest, overwhelmed by emotion too large for words. Around them, the crowd had begun to disperse, already spreading word of the dramatic scene they had witnessed. By tomorrow, all of Derby would know that the Duke of Wycliffe had publicly declared his love for a penniless teacher and admitted to a hidden disability. By the week's end, the story would have spread throughout the county. But as Grayson held Adelaide close, feeling the solid reality of her in his arms, he found he did not care. Let society talk. Let Lady Cordelia scheme. Let the magistrate question his judgment. None of it mattered compared to this moment, to this woman, to these children who had taught him that true nobility had nothing to do with titles or bloodlines. "We should return to Wycliffe," he said finally. "There is much to be done, and Lady Margaret will never forgive me if I do not bring you all back safely." "Together," Adelaide replied, the word carrying the weight of a vow. "We return together, and whatever comes, we face it together." As they loaded the children back into the carriages for the return journey, Grayson caught Diana's eye. The girl smiled at him with satisfaction and approval, and he found himself smiling back. She had been right to challenge Adelaide's decision to run. Sometimes the greatest courage lay not in protecting others from potential harm, but in trusting them to stand beside you when hardship came. The ride back to Wycliffe was entirely different from the sorrowful departure that morning. The children chatted excitedly about the wedding, about the new school, about the future that now seemed bright with possibility rather than shadowed by uncertainty. And in the first carriage, Adelaide sat with Grayson's arm around her shoulders, feeling for the first time in years that she had truly come home. The return to Wycliffe Manor was met with jubilation from the household staff, who had watched Adelaide and the children depart that morning with heavy hearts. Mrs. Hughes wept openly when the carriages rolled back into the courtyard, and even the usually stoic butler allowed himself a smile as he welcomed them home. Lady Margaret emerged from the house at a run, pulling Adelaide into an embrace before turning to her brother with a mixture of exasperation and pride. "I knew you would come to your senses," she said, swatting his arm affectionately. "Though you might have spared me several hours of anxiety by deciding a bit more quickly." "Some things," Grayson replied, his arm still around Adelaide's waist, "require dramatic gestures to be properly understood. I learned that from watching too many theatrical productions with you as a boy." The news of their engagement spread through the county with remarkable speed, carried by the travellers who had witnessed Grayson's public proposal at the Rose and Crown Inn. By evening, a steady stream of callers had begun arriving at Wycliffe Manor, some offering genuine congratulations, others clearly hoping to gather details for the gossip that would dominate drawing rooms for weeks to come. It was the following afternoon that brought the confrontation everyone had been anticipating. Lady Cordelia Winters arrived without invitation, sweeping into the drawing room where Adelaide sat with Lady Margaret and several of the older girls, reviewing fabric samples for their new school uniforms. "How cosy," Cordelia said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Playing at domesticity already, Miss Fairmont. Or should I say, future Duchess? Though I confess I find it difficult to imagine someone of your limited background managing the responsibilities of such a title." Adelaide set down the fabric she had been examining and rose to face her adversary with calm dignity. "Lady Cordelia, I was not aware you had been invited to call. I require no invitation to visit a family with whom I have long been acquainted," Cordelia replied, moving further into the room. "I have come to offer my congratulations on your extraordinary good fortune. It is quite remarkable how quickly circumstances can change, is it not? One day a penniless teacher living in a cellar, the next engaged to a duke. Some might even call it suspicious. And what exactly are you suggesting?" Lady Margaret asked, her voice cold. Cordelia's smile was sharp. "I suggest nothing. I merely observe that Miss Fairmont has proven remarkably adept at using unfortunate children to manipulate the sympathies of a man known for his rational judgment. One wonders if the entire situation was not carefully orchestrated from the beginning. After all, what better way to secure a position than to create a crisis that demands intervention?" Diana rose from her seat, her young face flushed with anger. "Miss Adelaide did not create anything except a way for us to survive when everyone else abandoned us, including people like you who care more about social standing than about children starving in cellars." "How bold," Cordelia said, her gaze flickering dismissively over the girl. "Tell me, child, has your teacher instructed you in the art of manipulating wealthy men as well? Or is that a skill reserved for her private lessons?" The insult was so blatant, so deliberately cruel, that for a moment no one spoke. Then Lady Margaret stood, her entire bearing radiating aristocratic fury. "You will leave this house immediately," she said, her voice cutting through the room like ice. "And you will cease spreading your vicious lies about my future sister-in-law, or I will ensure that certain facts about your own circumstances become public knowledge." Cordelia's confidence wavered slightly. "I have no idea what you mean." "Do you not?" Margaret moved closer, her eyes hard. "Then allow me to refresh your memory. I took the liberty of making my own inquiries after you began your campaign against Adelaide. It seems your late husband left you in considerably more debt than anyone realised. The Haverford estate is mortgaged to the hilt, your quarterly income barely covers your London residence, and you have been seeking a wealthy husband not out of affection, but out of desperate financial necessity." The colour drained from Cordelia's face. "That is a lie. It is a matter of public record," Margaret countered coolly. "Available to anyone who knows where to look. I also discovered that you have been borrowing money from several merchants on the promise of future payment once you secured an advantageous marriage. In short, Lady Cordelia, you are in precisely the same financial position as Adelaide was when circumstances forced her into desperate measures. The only difference is that she chose to steal bread to feed hungry children, while you chose to destroy an innocent woman's reputation to secure your own comfort." Cordelia's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You would not dare expose such information. The scandal would reflect on your family as well." "Try me," Margaret replied softly. "Attack my brother's fiancée again, question the legitimacy of his choices, or make one more comment suggesting that Adelaide has behaved with anything less than perfect integrity, and I will ensure every drawing room in England knows the truth about your circumstances. The choice, Lady Cordelia, is yours." For a long moment, the two women faced each other in tense silence. Then Cordelia turned on her heel and swept from the room without another word, her departure marked by the slam of the front door that echoed through the house. Adelaide sank back into her chair, trembling with a mixture of relief and residual anger. "Thank you," she managed. "Though I am not certain that was entirely wise. She will be even more dangerous now." "She will be silent now," Margaret corrected, "because she knows I have the power to destroy her social standing completely." Sometimes, Adelaide, the only way to deal with a bully is to demonstrate that you can hit back harder than they can hit you. The incident with Cordelia proved to be the last major obstacle before the wedding. Over the following 3 weeks, Wycliffe Manor transformed into a hive of activity as preparations for the ceremony moved forward. Grayson had insisted on a proper wedding with all the traditional elements, arguing that Adelaide deserved to be married with the same pomp and celebration as any duchess in England. The chapel at Wycliffe was cleaned and decorated, its old wood polished until it gleamed, and its windows hung with garlands of late spring flowers. The village seamstress was commissioned to create a wedding gown for Adelaide, working from a design that Lady Margaret had sketched based on the latest fashion plates from London. For the 11 girls, matching dresses were made in pale shades of pink, lavender and cream, transforming them into a rainbow of youthful beauty. The legal documents establishing the Adelaide Fairmont School for Girls Trust were finalised and signed 2 weeks before the wedding. Adelaide read through every page carefully, assisted by Grayson, who explained the legal terminology with a patience that spoke of his own struggles with complex text. The trust was remarkably generous, providing funding for not just one school, but a network of 5 institutions across 3 counties, all teaching the methods Adelaide Fairmont had developed for children who learned differently. "You are giving away a fortune," Adelaide observed as she reviewed the financial provisions. "This endowment alone could support several families in comfort for generations." "I am investing in the future," Grayson corrected. "Every child who learns to read using your mother's methods, every girl who escapes poverty through education, every young woman who secures meaningful employment because someone took the time to teach her properly, that is a return no amount of money could purchase." The wedding day dawned clear and warm, with late spring sunshine pouring through the windows of Adelaide's chambers as she prepared for the ceremony. Lady Margaret had insisted on helping her dress, dismissing the maids so they could have privacy for this final moment before Adelaide's life changed forever. "I never imagined this," Adelaide said softly as Margaret fastened the pearl buttons that ran down the back of her gown. 3 months ago, I was stealing bread and living in a cellar. Now, I am about to become a duchess." "You were always meant for greatness," Margaret replied, adjusting the veil that had been her mother's, now carefully altered to suit Adelaide's smaller frame. "Not because you are marrying a duke, but because you have the courage to fight for what you believe in and the strength to protect those weaker than yourself. That is true nobility, Adelaide. The title is merely society's acknowledgement of what you already are." The chapel was filled to capacity when Adelaide arrived on the arm of her cousin from Derby, who had come to give her away despite their limited acquaintance. The pews were packed with local gentry, curious villagers, and a surprising number of nobility from London who had travelled to witness the scandalous union between a duke and a penniless teacher. But Adelaide barely noticed the crowd. Her entire focus was on Grayson, standing at the altar in formal attire that made him look every inch the aristocrat he was born to be. His eyes found hers as she began her walk down the aisle, and the love she saw there made her breath catch in her throat. Preceding her down the aisle came the 11 girls, each carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers and walking with careful steps that suggested hours of practice. They took their places on either side of the altar, creating a living frame for the ceremony that was about to take place. The vicar cleared his throat and began the traditional words. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Grayson Richard Hartley, Duke of Wycliffe, and Adelaide Catherine Fairmont in holy matrimony." Adelaide barely heard the opening prayers, too focused on Grayson's face, on the way his hands trembled slightly as he took hers, on the emotion that made his voice rough when he spoke his vows. "I, Grayson, take you, Adelaide, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part. This is my solemn vow. Boom. When it was her turn, Adelaide's voice rang clear and strong through the chapel. I, Adelaide, take you, Grayson, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part. This is my solemn vow. The ring Grayson slipped onto her finger had belonged to his mother, a simple band of gold set with small sapphires that caught the light streaming through the chapel windows. As the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Diana stepped forward with a folded paper in her hands. "With your permission, Your Grace," she said, addressing Grayson formally, "I have composed a poem for this occasion. Miss Adelaide taught me that words have power to capture moments that might otherwise be lost to time. I wish to capture this moment." Grayson nodded, emotion evident in his eyes, and Diana began to read in a clear voice that carried through the silent chapel. She came with nothing but her courage worn thin. 11 souls dependent on choices made in darkness. He gave shelter, though he did not know the debt he owed. To the woman who had taught him light when all was dark. 2 hearts, broken by circumstance and fear, found healing in the legacy of love passed down through generations. Today, we witness not just the union of duke and teacher, but the continuation of a promise made years ago, that every child deserves to learn, to grow, to hope. That love is stronger than social convention. That true nobility lies not in title, but in action. May their union be blessed with joy. May their legacy extend through generations yet unborn. And may we who witness this day never forget that sometimes the greatest courage is simply to choose love. By the time Diana finished, there was not a dry eye in the chapel. Adelaide pulled the girl into a fierce embrace, followed by Grayson, who gathered them both close along with Rose and Mary, and all the other girls who pressed forward to share in the moment. The wedding breakfast that followed was a grand affair held in the ballroom of Wycliffe Manor. Tables groaned under the weight of food, and champagne flowed freely as toasts were offered to the bride and groom. To Adelaide's surprise, even some of the nobility who had seemed most sceptical about the match offered genuine congratulations, their initial reservations apparently overcome by the evident love between the couple and the nobility of purpose that had brought them together. Over the following months, society gradually accepted what it could not change. The story of the Duke, who had publicly admitted to dyslexia and married a penniless teacher, became one of those tales that was repeated with varying degrees of accuracy at dinner parties throughout England. Some viewed it as romantic, others as scandalous, but none could deny that the marriage appeared to be genuinely happy. The Adelaide Fairmont School for Girls opened its doors exactly 6 months after the wedding, in a newly constructed building on land that Grayson had purchased specifically for that purpose. The first class included the original 11 girls plus 15 others from the surrounding counties. Adelaide served as headmistress while continuing to teach several classes herself, her methods attracting attention from educators across England who came to observe and learn. The years that followed brought changes both large and small. Additional schools opened in 3 more counties, each following the Fairmont methods and each providing education to girls who might otherwise have been condemned to lives of servitude or worse. Adelaide's reputation as an innovative educator grew, and she was invited to speak at gatherings of teachers and reformers, always accompanied by Grayson, who took obvious pride in her accomplishments. 5 years after that dramatic wedding in the chapel at Wycliffe, Adelaide stood in the nursery of the manor, one hand resting on her swollen belly where their 3rd child grew, the other holding a primer as she worked with their eldest daughter on her reading lessons. "The letters keep moving, Mama," little Catherine said, frustration evident in her 4-year-old voice. "They will not stay still." Adelaide felt her heart squeeze with recognition of the challenge her daughter faced, the same challenge her father and grandmother had navigated before her. But instead of despair, she felt only determination. "I know, sweetheart," she said gently, reaching for the coloured overlays that had been developed based on her mother's original methods. "But we have special tools to help with that. See? When we put this pink paper over the page, Does it help the letters stay where they belong? Catherine's face brightened. Yes, I can read it now. From the doorway, Grayson watched his wife and daughter with an expression of profound contentment. In his arms, their 2-year-old son, James, squirmed to be put down, and Grayson set him gently on the floor, where the boy immediately toddled toward a pile of wooden blocks. She has your gift, Adelaide said, looking up at her husband with a smile. And my mother's legacy to help her navigate it. She has something better than that, Grayson replied, moving into the room to stand behind his wife, his hand joining hers on her rounded belly. She has parents who understand that different does not mean deficient, who will never let her believe that her struggles make her less than she is. A knock at the nursery door announced the arrival of Diana, now 19 years old and serving as the lead teacher at the original Fairmont school. She had grown into a poised young woman, her early promise fulfilled through years of education and opportunity. "Forgive the interruption, Your Grace," she said, addressing Adelaide with the formal title she insisted on using despite Adelaide's protests. "But the letter has arrived from London, the one we have been expecting." Adelaide's eyes widened. "From the palace?" Diana nodded, her face glowing with excitement. "King George IV herself has taken notice of the Fairmont schools. She wishes to grant them royal patronage and has invited you to present your methods at a gathering of the Royal Society for Education Reform." Grayson let out a low whistle. "Royal patronage. Your mother would have been so proud, Adelaide." "Ooh. Mother would have said that recognition from the palace matters far less than the lives we change every day," Adelaide replied, though she could not quite suppress her own excitement at the news. "But I confess, having the King's support will make it easier to expand the program to reach even more children." That evening, after the children had been put to bed and the household had settled into quiet, Adelaide and Grayson walked through the gardens of Wycliffe Manor hand in hand. The late summer air was soft and warm, carrying the scent of roses and lavender. "Do you ever regret it?" Adelaide asked suddenly. "The scandal of our marriage, the social complications it created, the way some members of society still view our union as beneath your station." Grayson stopped walking and turned to face her fully, cupping her face in his hands. "I regret only that I did not have the courage to choose you sooner. Every day with you has been a gift. Every child we have educated, every life we have changed through your mother's methods, every moment watching you teach our children that their differences make them unique rather than deficient. These are treasures beyond price." "Even the dyslexia?" Adelaide asked softly, knowing how long he had hidden that part of himself. "Especially the dyslexia," Grayson replied. "Because it taught me empathy for those who struggle. Because it brought your mother into my life, and through her, eventually you. Because it has made me a better father, a better husband, a better duke. I would not change it even if I could." As they stood together in the garden, the windows of the manor glowing warmly behind them, Adelaide reflected on the improbable journey that had brought them to this moment. From desperate theft in a dark kitchen to royal recognition of educational methods that could change lives. From 11 frightened children in a cellar to a thriving network of schools serving hundreds of girls. From a duke carrying the weight of hidden disability to a man who had learned that vulnerability could be strength when shared with the right partner. The legacy of Catherine Fairmont lived on, not just in the schools that bore her name, but in every child who learned to read despite struggling with letters that danced on the page. In every girl who escaped poverty through education. In every young woman who discovered that her worth was not determined by her circumstances, but by her character and courage. And in the love between a duke and a teacher who had learned that sometimes the greatest act of nobility was simply to choose love over fear, to fight for what mattered rather than accepting what was easy, and to build a legacy that would echo through generations yet to come. As Adelaide and Grayson returned to the house, they passed through the library, where the letters young Grayson had written to Catherine Fairmont were now carefully preserved in a glass case. A reminder of where it had all begun, and a promise of all that was yet to come. 9 months later, Adelaide gave birth to another daughter, whom they named Catherine, in honor of the woman whose methods and kindness had set all of this in motion. And on the day of her christening, surrounded by family and the girls who had become like daughters, with Diana reading another poem, and Rose, healthy now and stubbornly bright, clutched Diana's hand, while Diana stood as godmother, and Adelaide understood that some legacies transcended a single lifetime. They were writing a new story now, one that would be told and retold through the lives they touched, the children they educated, and the love they chose to fight for when it would have been easier to walk away. And somewhere, Adelaide liked to think, her mother was watching and smiling, knowing that the work she had begun in a small schoolroom 30 years ago had blossomed into something far greater than she could have imagined. Dear listeners, we hope you have enjoyed this journey of love, courage, and legacy. If this story has touched your heart, reminded you that our differences can be our strengths, and inspired you to fight for what truly matters, then we have done what we set out to do. Thank you for joining us at Wycliffe Manor, for witnessing Adelaide and Grayson's love story, and for believing that sometimes the greatest nobility lies not in titles or wealth, but in choosing love over fear and hope over despair. Until our next story, may you always have the courage to fight for what you love.